In the dim blue haze of a sleepy Monday morning, Maya wrapped her thrifted scarf tighter around her neck and stepped into the tiny cafe on 7th Street, the windows fogged with breath and steam. A soft hum of jazz crackled from the speaker above the counter, and the smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh espresso floated in the air like a gentle embrace. It was a place that carried stories in its wall-scratched tables, mismatched chairs, and baristas who knew regulars by name. Maya wasn't a regular here. She couldn't afford to be, but on this particular morning, she had something rare, an extra $5 bill. She had finished tutoring late last night, and the family had insisted she take a tip, something she usually refused. But today she wanted to treat herself a warm coffee, maybe even a croissant if she was lucky. She stood in line behind a tall man in a weathered coat whose presence was unassuming. His back was slightly hunched, his hair streaked with gray, and his shoes had the look of someone who walked far and often. There was a certain stillness about him, not the quiet of someone trying not to be noticed, but the heaviness of someone used to being invisible. Maya noticed his fingers were trembling slightly as he pulled out a few crumpled notes from his pocket. The cashier spoke gently. "I'm sorry, sir. You're about $1 short." The man blinked slowly, nodded with a tired smile, and reached to put the coffee back. Something in Maya's chest tightened. Maybe it was the way his shoulders folded inwards, or the brief flicker of disappointment he tried to hide. She stepped forward instinctively, placing her $5 bill on the counter. "It's fine," she said softly. "Just add it to his." The man turned to look at her, his eyes the softest shade of hazel, startled. "Unsure? You don't have to," he began, but Maya interrupted with a gentle shrug. "I know, but it's just coffee. It's a good morning for kindness, right?" The man stared at her for a moment longer, like he wanted to say something more, but simply nodded. "Thank you. You remind me of someone." They sat near opposite windows. Maya sipped her coffee slowly, savoring every warm drop, while the man sat quietly with both hands around his cup like it was more than just warmth. It was dignity. They didn't speak again, but every now and then, his eyes wandered back to her with a gaze that held stories. There was no recognition in Maya's look. How could there be? She didn't know who he was. She didn't know that she had just bought coffee for the man who had once held her as a baby before, vanishing from her life entirely. 23 years ago, in another city, under another name, Rowan Canna had walked away from everything. A scandal had rocked the family business, betrayal, legal chaos, and a sudden, dark decision made by the matriarch. He was to leave and never return. His young wife had begged him to stay, but he chose silence for their protection. A contract signed, a daughter unborn, a fortune split in fire and lawyers. He had watched from afar as his daughter grew, never daring to reach out, never daring to interfere, until today. He was in the city for an alumni event, an obligation he dreaded. But when he saw her, when he heard her speak, it was like lightning arced. Across decades of absence, Maya left the cafe without knowing the gravity of what had just happened. She went on with her day, taking the bus to the college campus, where she worked part-time and attended classes. Life was always a bit of a tightrope walk, balancing rent, tuition, tutoring gigs, and caring for her ailing grandmother. She didn't dwell on the man much. To her, it was just a kind act, one she hoped someone else would do for her someday. But for Rowan, that cup of coffee changed everything. He stayed in that cafe long after she left, holding the receipt with her name scribbled accidentally by the cashier. Maya paid for two. He folded it and placed it in his wallet like an artifact from a life he thought he'd forfeited forever. He remembered that name, the one he had written on birthday cards he never mailed, the one he had spoken into the night like a prayer, the daughter he had never touched past her second breath. The next few days, Rowan's mind was a storm. He had avoided wealth like it was poison after his exile, but time had a strange way of circling back. His investments had bloomed without him. He lived simply, almost like penance. But now he stood at a crossroads between remaining a ghost or doing something no one in his family expected, stepping into the light, no matter the cost. He hired a local investigator not for secrets or surveillance, but for truth. Who was Maya now? What kind of woman had she become? What had life given her? And more importantly, what had it taken? What the man found broke Rowan's heart. She was bright, fiercely independent, and kind, but life had been hard. She juggled more than a girl her age should. No parents, a grandmother in and out of the hospital. No scholarships, just hard work, She wasn't bitter. She didn't complain, and yet she carried the quiet ache of someone who had been forgotten. Rowan wept the night he read her file. This wasn't just a reunion. This wasn't about claiming the title of father that he had long since surrendered. This was about redemption, a second chance not to rewrite the past but to build something honest in the present. And so, he returned to the cafe the next morning, hoping she'd come again, hoping fate would give him another chance not to reveal everything yet but to be near, to find the right words, to earn even a moment of her time, not as a stranger with a secret, but as a man who had just been shown what grace looks like in the shape of a $5 act of kindness. The story was only just beginning. For the next 3 mornings, Rowan Canner returned to the same cafe, always sitting in the corner booth with a view of both the counter and the door. He never ordered before she arrived. He didn't want the smell of coffee or a half-finished cup to betray his restlessness. He simply waited, dressed in that same old overcoat that made him look like every other weary traveler in the city. But inside, he was anything but ordinary. Every tick of the clock felt like a drumbeat of hope, one that only the heart of a father desperate for atonement could hear. When Maya finally entered on the 4th morning, Rowan almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes framed by the kind of exhaustion only responsibility can craft, and her backpack was heavy with books and burdens. She looked like someone walking through a storm, but refusing to complain about the rain. She smiled politely at the barista, paid in coins this time, and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. It wasn't the coffee she had given him last time. It was just a small tea. Even in her own indulgence, she had limits. Rowan watched her with a growing ache. There she was, flesh of his blood, yet distant as a memory. He wasn't ready to speak, yet he didn't want to startle her, didn't want to turn this into a confession of guilt too heavy for her to carry. He only wanted to know her, not just the girl she was now, but the woman she was becoming. That morning, he timed his departure with hers, trailing a few steps behind as she exited the cafe. She moved quickly through the sidewalks, hopping onto a worn-out bus. Rowan didn't follow further. He wasn't stalking. He just wanted to understand her world, not invade it. That evening, back in his rented apartment, he unfolded her file again. It felt wrong, having a folder of someone he loved like a dossier. But it was all he had for now. His investigator, a kind retired officer named Ej, had done his work well. Maya's mother had passed when she was full brain aneurysm. Her maternal grandmother, Pushpa Devi, had taken her in, refusing to let Maya fall into the foster system. They lived in a modest flat near the city's older districts, scraping by on Pushpa's pension and Maya's tutoring income. Her father, he was marked absent, with no name listed. Maya had tried asking once. According to a teacher's report, the grandmother had simply said, "He's gone, but you're not missing anything. You're enough." Rowan felt like the words were branded into his chest. "You're not missing anything, but you are, and I was the coward who let you." Days passed in a blur of silent proximity. Rowan made it a routine to frequent the cafe, always keeping a careful distance, always hoping to catch a glimpse of Maya's resilience. He learned the rhythm of her life: early mornings, rushed lunches, late-night study sessions. He saw her help a stranger pick up fallen groceries. He saw her sit with a homeless woman and give away her own lunch. He saw her laugh rarely, but brightly, and he saw her cry once, outside a clinic after a phone call that must have brought bad news. He didn't approach. He only watched, hand on his chest, wishing his heart could speak louder than his shame. But fate is never content to wait. It often nudges you when you least expect it. That nudge came in the form of a small brown envelope Maya dropped as she hurried out of the cafe. One afternoon, Rowan saw it flutter to the ground like a wounded bird. By the time he picked it up, she was already gone, lost in the shuffle of midday crowds. The envelope was unsealed. Inside was a printed letter: hospital paperwork. Pushpa Devi's health had declined. Kidney failure, long waiting lists, dialysis every few days. The costs were rising, and Maya had scribbled in blue pen, "Need to apply for assistance. Try charity board again. Don't give up." Rowan read the words like they were her prayers on paper. The next morning, Rowan called in a favor, something he rarely did anymore. He contacted the hospital director, a man who once owed Rowan's family a great debt. Quietly, anonymously, he arranged to cover Pushpa Devi's treatment. Full sponsorship, no name attached, no conditions, just a clean slate and hope. He didn't want Maya to know. Not yet. It wasn't about credit, it was about conscience. 2 days later, Maya entered the cafe with a different energy. There was relief in her shoulders and a faint smile that wasn't just polite, it was real. She ordered her usual tea, but added a muffin this time. That tiny extra just a muffin was a celebration, a sign that something had gone right. Rowan felt a lump in his throat. His gesture had touched her life already, even if she never knew it was him. He sat across the cafe, quiet as ever, grateful for the chance to give without being seen. But fate wasn't done. As Maya got up to leave, she spotted him. Not just a glance this time, but recognition, not of who he was, but of who he had been in that earlier kindness. "You're the man from before," she said, walking over to him. Her voice was warm, curious, the one who couldn't afford coffee. "You've been here a lot lately." Rowan looked up, caught in her gaze. Her eyes were her mother's, fierce and kind at once. He nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "Yes, I like the place, the coffee, the quiet." She smiled. "Well, it's good to see you again. I'm Maya, by the way." She held out her hand. He shook it gently. "Rowan," he said, his voice catching slightly. "It's good to meet you, and for the first time in 23 years. Father and daughter looked into each other's eyes, not as strangers bound by coincidence, but as souls unknowingly tethered by blood, memory, and a story that was only just beginning to unfold. For the next few days, their conversations were brief and delicate, like the first cautious steps onto a frozen lake. Maya and Rowan, still strangers in the official sense, began to exchange simple greetings that slowly matured into soft dialogues. Over cups of coffee and tea, they didn't sit together every time, but there was an unspoken rhythm forming between them. Rowan never pushed. He never asked personal questions. He was content to listen. Maya, on the other hand, found herself oddly comforted by his presence. There was something familiar about him, something hard to place but impossible to ignore. He listened like no one else did, not with advice or interruption, but with eyes that stayed and a silence that felt safe. She began to talk about her classes, her worries about the future, and her grandmother's health in small bursts, almost by accident. Like she was unloading stones she didn't realize she had been carrying for too long. One chilly afternoon, Maya arrived with 2 coffees in hand and placed one in front of Rowan without a word. He looked up in surprise. She gave a half smile and said, "I figured it was my turn." Rowan chuckled quietly, the sound rusty in his chest like it hadn't been used in years. That cup of coffee, simple as it was, felt like a bridge one. He had no right to walk across, yet one she kept inviting him toward with each small gesture. That day, they talked longer. She told him about her dream to be a social worker, about how she wanted to help kids like she used to be, poor, lost, quiet. He told her vaguely about old travels, hinted at regrets, and said he once walked away from something important. She didn't pry. Instead, she said something that pierced him. "Sometimes you have to leave to protect something. Doesn't always make you a bad person, just someone who hurt in a different way." That night, Rowan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his small rental and remembered the hospital room where he had last seen Maya's mother, Sarika. He remembered how her hands had trembled, how she had begged him not to go. He remembered the weight of the contract his mother's lawyer had put in front of him, one that erased him from their lives in exchange for silencing the scandal that could have ruined them all. He had signed it, not because he wanted to disappear, but because staying would have dragged them through hell. And now, all these years later, he wondered whether silence was really the noble choice or just the coward's refuge. The next morning, Maya surprised him again by asking if he wanted to walk a few blocks. "I've got time," she said casually, not looking at him directly, "and the park nearby is nice. I usually sit there to think." He agreed, trying to steady the sudden wave of nervousness rising in him. As they walked side by side through the busy sidewalk and under golden leaves spinning from the trees, Maya spoke more freely. She told him about her childhood, about how her grandmother had never badmouthed her father, but also never explained his absence. "I always wondered," she said, hands tucked in her coat pockets, "but it didn't hurt as much as you'd think. Not until I saw other kids with theirs. Then it became a question I buried." "You ever have someone disappear on you?" Rowan's heart flinched, but he nodded. "Yes," he said, voice hoarse. "More than one. Some I chose to lose, others I had to let go of. Doesn't make it right, though." They stopped at a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks floated silently. Maya sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out a folded notebook. "This is where I write," she said, flipping to a page covered in tiny script. "Not poetry, not really, just thoughts. My grandmother always says paint needs a place to drain, or it'll rot everything else." She handed it to him without explanation. Rowan's hands trembled slightly as he held it, this small, sacred glimpse into the soul of the daughter he never got to raise. He read one passage. "Sometimes I think of my father as a window, not a door." He didn't walk away. He disappeared, like wind through glass, quiet, clean, and still. "I look for fingerprints." He handed the notebook back, his eyes wet but hidden behind his glasses. "That's beautiful," he said softly and painful. She nodded. "Yeah, that's how life writes sometimes." That night, Rowan made a decision. He couldn't live in this limbo forever. He had tasted her presence. He had felt the spark of something pure and unbroken beginning to rise from the ashes. But she deserved truth, not fiction wrapped in silence. Still, it wasn't time yet. He had to earn her trust, not by revealing the past, but by being present. Now, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about money or reputation or fear. He was thinking about healing. The next day, he visited Pushpa Devi in the hospital, not as her estranged son-in-law, but as a volunteer. He brought books, fruits, and a careful smile. She looked at him for a long moment, eyes narrowing with something close to recognition. "You're the man Maya talks about," she said at last. "The one at the cafe." He froze for a beat. "I suppose I am." She studied him. "I don't know who you are, but I know people. And Maya doesn't let people in easy. So, if she's let you near, don't hurt her. Don't disappear like her father did." The words hit like a silent bomb. Rowan nodded slowly. "I won't," he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in decades. Not again. Back in his room that night, he sat at his desk with a fresh sheet of paper. No more lawyers. No more contracts. Just ink and truth. He began to write a letter, not to Maya, but for her, something he would give her one day, when the time was right. Something that began not with an apology or an excuse, but with a single sentence. "You bought me coffee once, not knowing you were buying. Your father a second chance at life." It had been nearly 2 weeks since Maya had first offered that small act of kindness to a stranger. 2 weeks. And yet something about that man Rowan lingered in her thoughts longer than she expected. There was an energy in him, a silence that didn't feel empty, but somehow full of memory. He wasn't like the other elderly men who occasionally wandered into her world. No stories about politics or grandchildren or complaints about modern life. He listened more than he spoke. He looked at people like he was remembering something that could never quite be recovered. And most of all, there was something unspoken between them. Like a page just about to turn. Rowan felt it too. Every day, as they shared short walks and longer conversations, his heart split between two worlds. One where he could continue to bask in the warmth of her unknowingly returned affection, and one where he had to confess the truth that might shatter the fragile bond they had begun to build. The letter he had started sat in his coat pocket, folded carefully, heavy as stone. He carried it like a lifeline and a grenade, unsure of when to give it to her, unsure if he ever truly had the right. He had written and rewritten the lines a dozen times, changing a word here, a phrase there, trying to find the delicate balance between truth and tenderness. But the truth, his truth, was sharp and complicated, and he feared what it might do to her already burdened heart. One Saturday morning, Maya invited him to the bookstore cafe where she worked on weekends. "It's quiet early," she said, "before the crowd. They let me open up. And there's a corner table by the window no one touches but me." Rowan accepted, feeling a strange nervousness rise within him. This wasn't just about coffee anymore. This was about being allowed into her space, her world. It was sacred ground, and he knew it. When he arrived, she was already there, unlocking the front door and balancing a tray of muffins. She handed him one before he even sat down. "Blueberry," she said. "I saved it for you." The gesture stunned him, small as it was. He hadn't been saved anything in years. They talked for an hour that morning, watching the city stir awake. Through misted glass, Maya spoke about dreams, real ones, and the kind that came at night. "Sometimes I dream of a face," she confessed, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Not one I recognize, but it's always the same. A man standing at a train station. He's holding a letter, but he never gives it to me. I always wake up before he speaks. Rowan's heart clenched. He nearly pulled the real letter from his coat right then, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not yet. Dreams can be the soul remembering things the mind forgot. He said softly. Maya looked at him. You sound like my grandmother, she says. That too, and then came a shift. The bell above the bookstore's door jingled unexpectedly. A man in a crisp blazer and pointed shoes walked in, carrying a leather portfolio and a phone pressed to his ear. He paused when he saw Rowan. Sir, he said, a bit too loudly, your meeting has been moved to the Oberon Hotel. The board's ready when you are. Should I call your driver now? Maya blinked. Rowan paled. The man had just exposed a layer he'd worked hard to bury. Rowan waved him off awkwardly. No need. I'll be there shortly. The man nodded, shot Maya a polite smile, and left as quickly as he had come. Maya looked at Rowan now with a tilt of curiosity. Bored? Driver? She asked, half smiling. You told me you were retired. Rowan sighed, the weight of every secret he carried sinking into his shoulders. I am, he said slowly, but not from everything. There are obligations I've tried to keep quiet. Maya sat back, now searching his face more carefully. Who are you, really? She asked, not with accusation, but with a sense of genuine bewilderment. Rowan's lips parted, and the answer trembled on the edge of revelation. But then he stopped. Not because he didn't want to tell her, but because she deserved more than a rushed confession. Delivered in a moment of exposure, she deserved honesty prepared like a gift, not a wound. Someone who lost too much, he said, and someone who's trying, very late in life, to get back what little good he has left. Maya didn't push. She only nodded. That's fair, she said, but I hope one day you'll trust me with the full story. I think you have won. That afternoon, Rowan walked the city in silence. The hotel meeting was canceled. He didn't care. His mind was wrapped around her words. I hope one day you'll trust me. She didn't know how deeply that line had struck. He had spent decades surrounded by walls some built by circumstance, others by his own hands, and now, for the first time in so long, someone was offering to help him tear them down. But it wasn't just trust he feared. It was judgment. It was the look in her eyes when she would finally realize that the man who had stepped gently into her life was the same man who had walked out of it. Before she ever learned to speak his name, back at the hospital, Pushpa Devi sat propped up. In her bed, reading an old novel, Rowan entered quietly, sitting beside her with a bowl of fresh fruit. She knows you're hiding something, the old woman said without looking at him. And Maya may be kind, but she's not a fool. She's her mother's daughter. Rowan nodded slowly. I want to tell her. I do. But the more I love being near her, the more I fear what I'll lose when she finds out. Pushpa finally looked at him, her voice gentler than before. You already lost her once. Do you really want to do it again without fighting for her? He looked at the sleeping city through the window. No, he whispered, not this time. And so, he opened the letter again that night. He rewrote the final lines. He folded it carefully. He sealed it. And he placed it in an envelope with only one word on the front, Maya. The envelope stayed in his coat pocket for 3 days. 3 days of quiet anticipation, of breath held just beneath the surface, of words rehearsed silently in the mirror only to vanish the moment. He imagined her reaction. Rowan had never known fear like this, not in the boardrooms of his past, not in the legal wars he'd survived, not even when he walked away from the woman he loved with an infant still in her arms. Those moments, though painful, had the clarity of decision. But this was uncertainty, where love and loss wove together like the thin threads of a spider's web, trembling in the wind. What if she hated him? What if she never forgave him? What if the man she had trusted with coffee and conversation became, in an instant, a face she never wanted to see again? Maya, for her part, had grown increasingly curious. Rowan had become part of her life now, in the most unexpected and gentle way. He never pried, never overstepped. He simply showed up, reliably and silently present. And while she didn't know what he was hiding, she could feel it humming beneath his words, the ache of something unsaid. But Maya was not the kind to push. Her grandmother had taught her the strength of silence and the patience of time. People bloomed. She believed when they were ready, so she waited and she smiled. And she kept handing him warm cups and scraps of her thoughts. Because even if he never told her what was behind his eyes, he had earned her quiet trust. But life has a way of accelerating when truth begins to surface. One evening, a storm rolled in over the city. Sudden and fierce, thunder cracked across the sky like old bones breaking. Maya had just finished her shift at the bookstore cafe, and the buses were delayed. She stood at the edge of the curb, jacket pulled tightly around her, trying to decide whether to run or wait. That's when Rowan pulled up in an old black sedan, rolling the window down with a hesitant hand. "Get in," he said. "It's not safe out here." She climbed in without thinking twice. The car smelled faintly of worn leather and sandalwood. It was warm, safe. They drove in silence for a few blocks, the windshield wipers a steady rhythm over the tension inside. Rowan cleared his throat. "I need to give you something," he said, pulling into a quiet street and parking beside a closed flower shop. He reached into his coat and took out the envelope. Maya looked at it, confused. Her name was written on the front in elegant, deliberate script. "What is this?" she asked, already sensing that this moment would divide her life into before and after. Rowan didn't meet her eyes. "Just read it when you're ready, and whatever you feel after. I'll understand. I just needed you to know." She stared at the envelope in her lap. It was heavy, not in weight, but in presence. A silence settled between them like fog. Finally, she asked, "Is this about who you are?" Rowan nodded slowly. "And who I was, and who I should have been." She didn't press further. She didn't open it. She tucked it into her bag and said only one thing before asking him to take her home. "You've been kind. Whatever's in this letter, that won't change what I've seen." That night, Maya sat on her bed beneath a dim bulb, the letter resting like a stone beside her. Her grandmother was asleep in the next room. Outside, the storm had quieted, leaving behind only puddles and the scent of wet earth. Maya took a breath and unfolded the envelope. The pages inside were handwritten, every word careful and trembling. It began simply, "You once bought coffee for a stranger. You didn't know you were buying your father a second chance." The words hit her like a gust of wind that stole the air from her lungs. Her hands trembled as she read on about a scandal that tore a family apart, about the silence imposed on him by people too powerful to cross, about a man who watched from afar, saw her grow through year-old photographs and school news articles, but never dared to reach out, and then about the day he saw her again, grown and strong, and how she gave him kindness without knowing it was blood calling to blood. Maya read it twice, then a third time. There were no dramatic sobs, no shouts, just a quiet, stunned stillness that filled her room like mist. Her heart didn't know what to feel: betrayal, yes, but also something more complicated. Sadness for what was lost, shock at what had been hidden, but also curiosity. Even through all the pain, there was a part of her that still remembered. The man who listened so well, who sat across her in silence, who came back again and again, not because he had to, but because something inside him couldn't stay away. She didn't sleep that night. The sky lightened slowly, the clouds turning pink behind rooftops, and just before sunrise, she walked into her grandmother's room and sat beside her. She held her hand and whispered, "Did you know?" Pushpa opened her eyes slowly, looking at Maya with a calm that felt older than time. "I suspected," she said, "but I wanted it to come from him. Truth can't be forced. It has to arrive in its own time." Maya sat there for a long while, the letter still clutched in her hand. Later that morning, she stepped out into the street and took the long walk to the cafe. Rowan was already there, sitting at their usual corner table, staring into his untouched cup. He looked up when she arrived. She didn't speak right away. She just sat down across from him, pulled out the letter, and placed it gently on the table. Then, quietly, she said, "Tell me about my mother." And just like that, the door didn't slam shut. It opened. The cafe was quieter than usual that morning. The usual buzz of early customers, the hum of the espresso machine, and the gentle murmur of baristas calling out orders all seemed to mute themselves around Maya and Rowan as they sat across from each other, steam rising between them from untouched cups. The letter, now neatly folded and resting on the table like an old photograph, carried the weight of decades. But Maya wasn't holding it anymore. She was looking at Rowan not with anger, not even with shock, but with a quiet, steady gaze that demanded truth and offered space for it to be spoken. When she asked about her mother, Rowan's voice cracked before the words even began. He had spent so long imagining this moment in shadows, always fearing it would come with slammed doors and bitter eyes. But here she was, open, present, asking, not for an explanation, but for memory. He spoke slowly at first, like someone revisiting a home left long ago. He told her about Sarika, the young woman with bright eyes who had believed in dreams, even when the world turned cold. He told her about how they had fallen in love when he was still tangled in the gilded cage of his family's name, how Sarika had given him a reason to imagine a different life, one built not on legacy, but love. He told her about the scandal that destroyed his father's company, the family's insistence that he take the fall, and the ultimatum that followed, leave and leave them behind, or destroy them all with the truth. He chose silence not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. They offered me money to disappear, he said, his voice thick, but it wasn't about the money. It was about control. I thought I was protecting you both. I thought one day I'd find the courage to come back. Maya listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because she had cried enough growing up without answers. Now, she wanted understanding. She wanted to stitch meaning into the gaps that once only held grief. Why didn't you reach out later? She asked finally, after she died, after I was old enough to know. Rowan looked down at his cup. Because I had become the ghost they made me, and I feared that if I came back, I'd only break more pieces of you. They sat like that for a long time, father and daughter, suspended between a past too broken to fix and a future too uncertain to predict. But in the stillness, something shifted. Maya reached across the table and touched his hand. Just a light touch, not a promise, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. A beginning. In the weeks that followed, the two of them walked slowly through the fragile terrain of reconnection. They didn't call each other father or daughter at first. That would come later, in moments unplanned. Instead, they built small rituals. Saturday mornings at the park, quiet lunches at the hospital with Pushpa Devi, who watched their growing bond with eyes that held both sorrow and pride. Rowan never tried to buy his way into Maya's life. He didn't offer her money or property or empty gifts. What he offered was presence. He showed up when she needed a ride to the clinic. He waited quietly outside her final exam just to say, "I'm proud of you." He brought flowers to her grandmother not out of obligation, but gratitude. He stood beside them in ways that no longer needed explanation. Maya never asked him for anything. But slowly, she began to ask him into things: a small dinner with her classmates, a storytelling session at the local library where she volunteered, a lecture on social justice where she made him sit in the front row. Each time he came, each time she looked over to make sure he was still there. It was during one of those afternoons at the cafe, months after the letter had been read, after truths had been spoken, and after wounds had begun to close, that Maya walked in with a book tucked under her arm. She sat across from Rowan with a smile he hadn't seen since she was a child in his memories. "I wrote something," she said. "I think you should be the first to read it." The book was a self-published collection of essays. On the cover was a sketch of a paper cup with steam rising. The title read, "The Coffee That Changed Everything." He opened it with reverence. The first page began with a dedication to the stranger who wasn't a stranger at all, for teaching me that some truths take longer to brew, but they're worth every sip. Rowan didn't speak for several minutes. His eyes stayed on the page, but his hand found hers across the table. She squeezed it, gently. There were still things they had to work through. There were still gaps, still scars, but they weren't building on ashes anymore. They were building on understanding. That summer, they took a short trip together to the town where Sarika had once lived, where Maya had never been. They visited an old temple she had loved, walked the streets where Rowan once held her as a baby, and placed flowers on her grave together. They stood there for a long time, neither needing to speak. Maya finally whispered, "She would have liked to see us like this," and Rowan, voice barely audible, replied, "I see her in you every day." Back in the city, their story slowly became known to those closest to Maya, not as a scandal or a secret, but as a testament to what forgiveness can look like when given the time to grow. The man she once helped out of kindness became the man she chose to keep, because in the end, the best families aren't just made of blood, they're made of grace, truth, and the courage to show up again after you've disappeared. And every time someone asked Maya why she still visited that small, ordinary cafe, why she still sat at the same corner table with the same old man, she would smile and say, "Because this is where I found something I never knew I'd lost."